She did not ask his name. She did not ask how the wound in his side had opened, or who had left him to bleed out in the bitter cold of her stable. The wind was a blade against the high plains, and her small homestead was the only shelter for miles. Finding a mountain of a man, curled in the straw beside her placid gelding was a complication she could not afford. Yet leaving him there to die was a cruelty she could not perform. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. One more mouth, even for a short time, was a danger. A dead man in her barn was a different kind of danger. She stood in the flickering lamplight, the grey wool of her scarf pulled tight around her face, and weighed the costs. He was huge, far larger than her late husband, with shoulders that strained the seams of his hide coat even as he lay unconscious. A thick, untamed beard was matted with ice and something dark. He smelled of pine, cold earth, and blood. Her horse, Bow, snorted softly, unafraid. That was the first thing that decided her. Bow was a good judge of character. The second was the tremor that ran through the man's large frame, a deep, agonal cold that had nothing to do with the winter outside. He was dying. She went back to the cabin, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The silence inside was louder than the wind. It was a silence shaped by the absence of her husband, Chen, a space where his quiet breathing should have been. She stoked the fire in the small cast-iron stove, her movements economical and practiced. She filled a kettle with water from the bucket, her mind working through the inventory of her larder, her medicines. There was so little. A half sack of flour, dried beans, salted pork, a few precious jars of preserved peaches. Enough for one person to survive a hard winter, if that person was careful. It was not enough for two. Still, she tore a clean strip from an old linen sheet and gathered her small tin of medicinal salve. When she returned to the stable, he was awake. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, followed her every move. There was no panic in them, only a deep, weary appraisal. He did not speak. He did not try to rise. He simply watched as she knelt beside him, the lamp casting their shadows long and dancing against the rough-hewn wood. "I have to see the wound," she said. Her voice was small in the vastness of the night, but steady. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His trust was a heavier weight than his body. Gently, she eased back the layers of hide and wool. The wound was a vicious gash along his ribs, deep and ragged. It was crudely stitched with what looked like sinew, but it was inflamed and weeping. He must have done it himself, a last, desperate act before his strength gave out. She worked in silence, cleaning the injury with hot water and her strong, gentle hands. He did not flinch, though she saw the muscles in his jaw clench tight. When she was done, she applied the salve and bound his side with the clean linen. She helped him sit up, propping him against a bale of hay. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, but he accepted her help without a word. His silence was a presence, not an absence. It was a solid, watchful thing. She stood, brushing the straw from her dark blue dress. The question of what to do next hung between them. He could not stay in the stable, the cold would kill him by morning. He could not come into her home, that was a line she had not yet decided to cross. She looked at his face, etched with hardship and pain, but holding a quiet dignity she recognized. It was the dignity of survival. She thought of Chen, of how he would have simply done the right thing, without counting the cost. Her own heart had grown so small and practical since his passing. She made a decision. She would give him one night. One meal. She would see if he lived until dawn. "Have you eaten?" or the widow asked. The man looked at her, his grey eyes holding hers for a long moment. He shook his head once, a small, tired movement. She nodded, turned, and walked back toward the light of her cabin, leaving the door open behind her. It was an invitation. After a long silence, she heard the slow, heavy scrape of boots on snow as he followed. He slept on a pallet of blankets by the fire, a place her husband had never occupied. Lian had spent the first hours of his presence in her home sitting in her rocking chair, a heavy iron poker resting across her lap. But his breathing soon settled into a deep, exhausted rhythm, and the tension in the small cabin eased. He was a force of nature brought low, not a common marauder. The next morning, the world was white and silent, buried under a fresh blanket of snow. The man was still asleep. She moved about her morning chores with practiced quiet, feeding the chickens, milking her single goat, her thoughts a low hum beneath the surface of the silence. When he finally stirred, the sun was a pale disk in the winter sky. He sat up slowly, his face grim with pain. His eyes found her immediately, tracking her as she ladled thin oat porridge into 2 bowls. She placed one on the small crate beside his pallet, along with a cup of weak tea. He looked at the bowl, then at her. "Thank you," he rasped. His voice was a low rumble, like stones moving deep underground. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single word. She simply nodded and took her own meal to the small table by the window, turning her back to him. It was a necessary distance, a boundary drawn in the air of the tiny room. The house itself was a wounded thing. Every object held a memory of Chen. The sturdy table he had built, the slightly crooked shelf where her porcelain teapot sat, the worn spot on the floorboards by the door where he used to stomp the snow from his boots. After his passing, Lian had folded his life away. His clothes were in a trunk, his tools hung clean and silent in the shed. She had learned to live around the shape of his absence, her routines a constant, quiet prayer. Bringing this stranger inside felt like a violation of that sacred space, a disruption of her grief. And yet, the silence felt different with him in it. It was no longer empty. It was watchful. It was shared. She ate slowly, her gaze fixed on the swirling snow outside. She could feel him eating behind her, the soft scrape of the spoon against the bowl a small, domestic sound in the vast quiet. She was acutely aware of his size, of the way he seemed to fill the room even when lying down. He was a creature of the mountains, of wide open spaces, and her small, fiercely protected world felt fragile around him. The day passed in a series of these silent, shared moments. She changed his dressing again. The wound was clean, but it would be a long time healing. He drank the willow bark tea she prepared for the fever, his eyes never leaving her face as he swallowed the bitter liquid. He did not ask for anything. He did not complain. He simply accepted what was offered with a grave stillness that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He slept for most off-day, a healing sleep that was a testament to the warmth of the cabin and the small measure of safety he must have felt. For Lian, the hours stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? Who were the men who had left him for dead? But she did not ask. To ask was to invite a story, and a story was a tie, a bond she was not ready for. Her life was about subtraction now, not addition. She had her small plot of land, her animals, and her memories. It was a small, hard life, but it was hers. And she intended to keep it that way. That evening, as she banked the fire for the night, he spoke again. "Jonas," he said, his voice still rough. She turned from the stove, surprised. He was looking at the fire, his large hands resting on the blanket. "My name is Jonas." She held the silence for a moment, then gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Lian," she replied softly. It was a trade. A beginning. A small thing, but in the quiet of the cabin, it felt momentous. She went to her bed behind the privacy curtain, but sleep did not come easily. The sound of another person's breathing in her home was a ghost of a comfort, a painful reminder of all she had lost, and a terrifying hint of something she might be forced to find. By the third day, Jonas was able to stand, leaning heavily on the wall for support. He moved to the window and stood for a long time, looking out at the endless expanse of snow-covered mountains. He was like a great, wounded bear, restless in his confinement. Lian watched him from the corner of her eye as she kneaded bread dough. His presence had altered the very air in the cabin. It was no longer just her space. A strange, unspoken partnership began to form, built on small acts and silent observation. He could do little, but he did what he could. When she brought in a heavy bucket of water from the well, his hand would appear, taking it from her without a word and setting it by the stove. When a log shifted and fell from the fire, he used the poker to push it back into the flames before she could move. They were small things, gestures that cost him little in strength but spoke volumes in intent. He was not a man accustomed to being cared for. He was a man who provided. One small thing at a time. As his strength slowly returned, so did his utility. He sat by the fire for hours, his hands busy. He took the handle of her favorite wooden spoon, which had split down the middle, and meticulously bound it with fine cord, making it stronger than before. He noticed her struggling with a dull skinning knife and spent an entire afternoon sharpening it on a whetstone he produced from a pocket in his coat, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a steady, comforting sound. Lian accepted these small gifts in the same way she offered her care, silently. She would find the repaired spoon on the table and simply begin using it. She would pick up the newly sharpened knife and feel the perfect, keen edge. In return, the broth she served him grew thicker, with more vegetables and small pieces of salted pork. She took one of Chen's old, flannel shirts from the trunk, washed it, and left it folded at the end of his pallet. It was far too small in the shoulders for him, but it was warmer than his torn one. He put it on without comment, the fabric straining against his powerful build. The first time he went outside, the cold air hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the small porch, breathing deeply, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Lian watched him through the window, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. He was still weak. But he did not go far. He walked to the woodpile, which was her most pressing concern. It was shrinking at an alarming rate. He picked up the axe, tested its weight, and with slow, measured swings, began to split the logs she had been unable to manage. Each thud of the axe was a declaration. I am not a burden. I pay my way. He worked for only a short time before his face grew pale and he had to lean against the stack of wood, breathing heavily. But he had split more in those few minutes than she could in an hour. He had made a contribution. He was earning his keep, one small thing at a time. That afternoon, a visitor arrived. A man on a fine horse, dressed in a thick wool coat and a beaverskin hat. Mr. Hemlock, the banker from the nearest town. He was the one who held the note on her land. He dismounted, his smile not reaching his cold, assessing eyes. Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice overly smooth. Just checking on you, my dear. A hard winter for a woman alone. Lian stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, blocking the entrance. I am managing, Mr. Hemlock. His eyes flickered past her, toward the cabin, and then to the freshly split wood. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. So I see. Still, it is a great deal of land for one little lady. I have a standing offer, you know. A fair price. Enough to see you settled comfortably back in the city, where you belong. This is where I belong, Lian said, her voice quiet but firm. From inside the cabin, Jonas listened, his face as still and hard as granite. He heard the false concern in the man's voice, the predatory circling. He had heard voices like that before. They always preceded a theft. The animals were the first to fully accept him. Bao, her gelding, who was usually skittish around strangers, would nuzzle at Jonas's coat, searching for a treat he never offered but seeming to enjoy the man's large, calming presence. The chickens, which scattered whenever Lian approached, would peck placidly at the ground near his feet as he sat on the porch step, mending a piece of harness. Even the half-wild barn cat, a creature of pure transactional affection, began to weave around his legs, arching its back for a scratch he would sometimes bestow with a slow, deliberate hand. Lian watched these small surrenders and found her own defenses softening. The fear she had felt on that first night was gone, replaced by a wary sort of comfort. The silence in the cabin was no longer lonely. It was companionable. She began to leave the curtain to her sleeping area partly open at night, a small, unconscious gesture of trust. She no longer kept the poker by her rocking chair. The man, Jonas, was a quiet guardian, not a threat. His routines became intertwined with hers. He rose before she did, his large frame moving with surprising stealth. By the time she was awake, he would have already stoked the fire, the cabin warm against the morning chill. He never presumed to make coffee, a ritual that had been hers and Chen's, but the kindling was always laid, the water kettle filled. It was a silent conversation, a daily dance of respect and reciprocation. He took over the heavy work entirely. The woodpile grew from a dwindling worry to a formidable fortress of neatly stacked logs, enough to last them through the worst of the winter and beyond. He rehung the heavy barn door, which had been sagging on its leather hinges, making it swing smoothly with a single push. He found the source of the draft in the cabin's west wall and chinked it with a mixture of mud and dried grass, a skill he seemed to know instinctively. He worked steadily, methodically, never asking for thanks, his reward simply the rightness of a job well done. Lian, in turn, found herself cooking more. The portion she served grew larger. She baked bread twice a week instead of once, the warm, yeasty smell filling the small cabin. One afternoon, he came in from the cold, his beard frosted with ice, and she handed him a mug of hot tea sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through her, a feeling so unfamiliar she almost dropped the mug. He looked at her, his grey eyes holding a question he would never speak. She just nodded and turned back to her work, her heart beating a little faster. The softening was not a sudden event. It was a slow thaw, like a frozen river in springtime, cracking and shifting one small piece at a time. It happened when she saw him checking the fence line at the far end of her property, a chore she had been putting off, and realized he was not just earning his keep for the day or the week. He was tending to the future of the homestead. He was tending to her future. One evening, as a storm raged outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the door, she found him looking at the one photograph she kept on the mantelpiece. It was of her and Chen, taken on their wedding day. They were so young, their faces bright with a hope that now felt like a distant country. He did not touch the photograph, but he looked at it for a long time. He was a good man, Jonas said, he's back to her. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, gleaned from the sturdy table, the well-kept tools, the love that still echoed in the bones of the house. Yes, Lian whispered, her throat tight. He was in that moment, he was no longer just a stranger she had taken in. He was a witness to her loss, a quiet sharer of her grief. He saw the shape of the wound in her life, and he did not try to fill it. He simply stood beside it, his silent strength a buttress against the storm, both outside and in. The rhythm of their days settled into a quiet counterpoint of labor and sustenance. His axe in the woodpile was answered by her spoon in the stewpot. The scent of his pine and earth masculinity mingling with her herbs and baking bread became the scent of home. It was a fragile piece, built in the heart of a brutal winter, and they both knew it was temporary. He was a man of the mountains, and she was a woman tied to this specific patch of earth. When his wound was healed, he would leave. It was the unspoken truth that lay beneath every shared meal, every silent glance. And yet, the silent reciprocation continued, a language more eloquent than words. He began leaving small carvings on the porch rail for her. A tiny, perfectly rendered bird one morning. A curled-up fox the next. They were made from scraps of firewood, whittled with his sharp knife during the long, dark evenings. She never mentioned them, but she would touch them gently as she went out for her morning chores, a small, secret smile on her lips. She gathered them up one by one and placed them on the crooked shelf Chen had built, a silent collection of his quiet thoughts. In return, she began to care for his things. She took his heavy hide coat, stiff with dirt and dried blood, and worked on it for days. She scraped it clean with a dull knife, then rubbed it with goat fat until the leather was supple again. She patched the holes with scraps of buckskin and restitched the seams with strong linen thread. It was a long, arduous task. When she was finished, the coat was not new, but it was whole. It was cared for. She left it hanging on a peg by the door. He saw it when he came in from checking his snare lines. He stopped and ran a hand over the mended shoulder, his touch gentle. He looked over at her where she sat mending a sock, her head bent over her work. He said nothing, but his gaze was heavy with a gratitude he could not voice. The next day, he built her a new milking stool. Her old one was wobbly and low, and she often finished the task with an ache in her back. The new one was solid, made of pine, the perfect height. It appeared by the goat's pen one morning, as if it had grown there overnight. This was their way. A need observed was a need met. An act of care was answered with an act of labor. It was a conversation held in wood and thread, in food and firewood. One afternoon he returned from the woods not with a rabbit for the pot, but with a bundle of willow branches. He sat by the fire that evening, patiently weaving them into a sturdy basket, his large hands surprisingly nimble. When it was finished, he set it by her sewing things. It was for her yarn, which she kept in a messy pile. It was a thing of simple beauty and perfect utility. He saw a small chaos and brought it order. He saw a need and he filled it. Lian felt a profound and terrifying sense of rightness in his presence. The cabin, which had felt so empty after Chen's death, now felt full. Not just with his physical presence, but with the quiet hum of his energy, his competence, his steady, watchful care. She had been a solitary planet, her orbit defined by loss. Jonas had entered her gravity, and now their orbits were intertwined. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, the quiet efficiency of his movements. She learned the sound of his breathing in sleep, the heavy tread of his boots on the porch. These small intimacies were terrifying. They were the foundations of a life she had sworn she would never have again. And yet, she did nothing to stop them. She simply set another place at the table, a second cup by the stove. A silent admission that his presence was no longer a temporary arrangement, but the new shape of her days. The first sign that their fragile peace was under threat came with the thaw. The snow began to recede, exposing the hard, frozen ground. And with the passable trails came Mr. Hemlock. He arrived unannounced one afternoon, his horse trampling the muddy ground near the porch. This time, Jonas was outside, splitting the last of a large log. He did not stop his work, but his swings became more deliberate, more powerful. Each thud of the axe was a warning. Hemlock dismounted, his expensive boot sinking into the mud. He ignored Jonas completely, as if he were a piece of the landscape, and addressed himself to Lian, who stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Chen," he began, his smile as thin as a razor cut. "I trust the winter treated you well." "We managed," Lian said, a use of the word "we" deliberate and pointed. Hemlock's eyes finally slid to Jonas, a flicker of contempt in his gaze. He looked at the man's size, his rough clothes, and the formidable woodpile behind him. He saw a complication. "I see you have hired help," he said, his tone dismissive. "A wise precaution. But it cannot last. The offer on your land still stands. In fact, given the circumstances, I might even be persuaded to be a little more generous. A quick sale, no fuss. You could be gone before the real mud season begins. The land is not for sale, Mr. Hemlock," Lian said. Her voice did not waver. Jonas stopped his work, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He stood straight, his silence more intimidating than any threat. He watched Hemlock, his grey eyes missing nothing. "A pity," Hemlock said, his smile tightening. "A woman alone, or nearly alone, can find herself in all sorts of unfortunate situations. Fences break. Livestock wanders. Accidents happen. It would be a shame to see all your late husband's hard work come to nothing." The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse, riding away without a backward glance. The air he left behind felt tainted. That evening, the quiet in the cabin was different. It was heavy, charged with a new tension. Lian stared into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. Jonas sat at the table, cleaning his skinning knife with slow, methodical strokes. "He has been here before," Jonas stated. It wasn't a question. "Twice," Lian confirmed. "He wants the water rights. My plot has the only year-round spring on this side of the mountain." Jonas nodded slowly. It made a cold, brutal sense. Men like Hemlock didn't see land, they saw assets. They didn't see a home, they saw an obstacle. The next day, Jonas walked the entire perimeter of her property. He was gone for hours. When he returned, his face was grim. He walked into the barn and came back with a length of cut wire. He laid it on the table before her. "This is from the north fence," he said. "Where the cattle pasture is." Leon looked at the wire. The cut was clean, straight. It was not the ragged break of wire snapping under strain or rust. It was cut with pliers. "It was not the weather," she whispered. "No," Jonas said, his voice a low growl. It was not the weather. He did not say Hemlock's name. He did not have to. The respectable man with the clean boots and the smooth voice had left his mark. It was a small thing, a single cut wire on a long fence line. But it was a seed of malice, planted in the hope that it would grow into ruin. Jonas took the wire and threw it into the fire, where it glowed red and then was consumed. He said nothing more, but Leon saw a new look in his eyes. It was a cold, hard vigilance. The wounded bear was healed. And now, his territory had been threatened. The blizzard arrived with the ferocity of a cornered animal. It did not come on slowly. One moment the sky was a sheet of grey, the next the world dissolved into a howling vortex of white. The wind shrieked, tearing at the little cabin, searching for any weakness. Snow piled in drifts that buried the windows and climbed the walls, isolating them completely. For 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The storm was a relentless assault, a physical pressure that seemed to want to crush their small pocket of warmth and light. In the heart of the storm, their unspoken partnership was forged into a true alliance. They were no longer a widow and a stranger, but 2 people fighting for a shared survival. The fortress of firewood Jonas had built became their salvation. He kept the stove fed, its steady warmth a bulwark against the killing cold. Leanne's well-stocked larder, which had seemed so meager, now felt like a bounty. She made stews that simmered for hours, filling the cabin with the rich scent of herbs and salted pork, a defiance against the sterile fury of the blizzard. Her calm, steady presence was as vital as the fire. She moved through the storm-tossed days with a quiet competence that Jonas watched with a deep, silent appreciation. She did not panic. She did not despair. She measured out the flour, counted the candles, and mended their clothes as if it were any other day. Her endurance was a match for his strength. On the 2nd day, the howling of the wind was joined by a new sound, the desperate bleating of the goat from the small barn. Jonas bundled himself in his mended coat and tied a rope from the cabin door to the barn door, a lifeline against the blinding whiteout. He fought his way through the storm and returned minutes later with the goat in his arms, its terrified eyes wide. He deposited the animal in the corner of the cabin, where it promptly began to chew on a blanket. The small absurdity of it broke the tension, and for the first time, Leon saw the corner of his mouth twitch in a near smile. It was in the lulls, when the wind paused to draw breath, that the silence between them changed. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of profound intimacy. They were 2 souls adrift in a sea of white, their small cabin an ark. It was in one of these lulls that he finally spoke of his past. He told her of a silver claim in the high mountains, a strike that was meant to be his future. He spoke of a partner, a man with a smooth voice and a ready smile, who had registered the claim in his own name and used a bought sheriff to run Jonas off the mountain. The story was sparse on details, but rich in a betrayal that was still a raw wound. He looked respectable, Jonas said, his eyes on the fire. Like your Mr. Hemlock. Leon listened, her heart aching for the injustice of it. She understood now the source of his deep-seated distrust of smiling men in clean coats. In return, she found herself speaking of Chen. Not of his death, but of his life. Of his dream for this land, of the way he believed in the promise of a place you could build with your own 2 hands. She spoke of his kindness, his quiet strength. He would have liked you, she said softly, and the truth of the words surprised her. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by a world that wanted to erase them, they laid down the burdens of their pasts. The shared confessions, spoken in low voices against the howl of the wind, were a new kind of warmth. They were no longer just surviving the winter. They were surviving it together. When the storm finally broke, the silence it left behind was absolute. The world was remade, a landscape of impossible, sculptural drifts under a painfully bright sun. Their cabin was a small, breathing creature buried in a tomb of white. It took Jonas the better part of a day to tunnel out, the work hard and slow. When he finally broke through to the open air, the sheer scale of the snow was breathtaking. They were marooned. The road to town would be impassable for weeks. Their isolation, once a product of geography, was now complete. The survival crisis had passed, but a new, more pressing one began. Their larder was severely depleted. The storm had lasted longer than they had anticipated. The arithmetic of their survival had to be recalculated. It was now that Jonas's hidden depths, his lifetime of knowledge from living in the high mountains, became their most valuable resource. He was a man who knew how to read the landscape, even one buried in snow. He knew how to listen to the silence and hear the faint stirrings of life beneath it. He crafted snowshoes from willow branches and strips of hide, his movements deft and certain. While Leon managed the dwindling resources of the cabin with a fierce economy, he ventured out into the white world. He moved with a quiet purpose, a ghost in the snow. He showed her how to find the sunny slopes where the thin crust of snow might hide hibernating marmots. He taught her to identify the subtle tracks of the snowshoe hare, and he set snares made of fine wire along their runs. He returned each day not with a bounty, but with just enough. A single plump rabbit. A brace of ptarmigan, their white feathers almost invisible against the snow. It was never more than they needed for a day or two. He was a part of the mountain's ecosystem, taking only his share, never wasting. Leon learned to trust his quiet competence completely. He was her provider, her protector. In the evenings, a new routine emerged. After their meager but nourishing meal, he would work on his carvings, and she would read to him from one of the 2 books she owned, a copy of the Bible, and a tattered volume of poetry. Her voice was soft and clear in the lamplight, a thread of civilization in the vast wilderness. He would listen, his hands never stilling, his expression unreadable. But she knew he was listening, because one night, after she read a poem about a ship lost at sea, she found a carving of a perfect, tiny ship on the mantel the next morning. It was his way of saying, "I heard you." This life, forced upon them by the storm, began to feel less like a hardship and more like a strange, unexpected gift. The world and its troubles, men like Hemlock, the demands of society, had been erased by the snow. There was only the cabin, the fire, the quiet work of survival, and the growing, unspoken bond between them. One night, she looked up from her book and found him watching her, his usual guard down. In his grey eyes, she saw a raw, unguarded tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. The world outside was cold and silent and vast, but inside the small, warm cabin, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. The thaw, when it came, was slow and then sudden. The world began to weep, streams of meltwater carving paths through the snow. The roof of the cabin dripped. The ground turned to a thick, clinging mud. And with the clearing of the roads, the outside world returned, bringing its dangers with it. Mr. Hemlock did not wait long. He arrived one morning looking furious, his fine horse splattered with mud. He had clearly expected to find a tragedy, a deserted homestead to be claimed for pennies on the dollar. Instead, he found a sturdy, smoking chimney, a cleared path to the barn, and Jonas, splitting wood with the calm, powerful rhythm of a man who belonged there. Hemlock strode past him and hammered on the cabin door. When Leon opened it, he pushed a sheaf of papers into her hand. "Foreclosure notice, Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice stripped of its usual false cordiality. "It seems your late husband took out a loan for seed and equipment." "A loan he defaulted on." "The bank is calling it in." Leon stared at the papers, her blood running cold. Chen had been meticulous. They had never taken a loan they couldn't repay. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "We paid for everything with the money we saved. The bank's ledger says otherwise," Hemlock sneered. "You have 30 days to pay the full amount, or vacate the property." He turned to leave, but Jonas was suddenly there, blocking his path. He was not touching the man, but his sheer size was a physical threat. He held out his hand. "The papers," he said, his voice a low rumble. Hemlock hesitated, then thrust them at him. Jonas looked at the papers. He couldn't read well, but he could read numbers. and he could read the signature at the bottom. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that. He had seen a signature just like it on his own stolen mining claim. The same man, the same method. His quiet investigation began that day. He did not announce it. He simply started watching. He followed Hemlock's trail back towards town, keeping to the trees. He was a hunter, and Hemlock was now his prey. He observed the man's comings and goings. He saw him visit 2 other small, isolated homesteads, owned by an elderly couple and another recent widow. He saw the same false smile, the same sheaf of papers. He was a vulture, preying on the vulnerable. Jonas knew he needed more than suspicion. He needed proof. He remembered something the old prospector who had taught him the mountains used to say: men are careless with what they throw away. For days, Jonas spent his time not in the woods hunting for game, but in the muddy outskirts of the town, sifting through the rubbish heap behind the bank. It was a grim, thankless task. But his patience was a thing of stone. And finally, he found it. Discarded in a pile of ash and refuse were several crumpled pieces of paper. They were practice sheets. On them, over and over, were the forged signatures of Chen and the other homesteaders, as Hemlock perfected his craft. Beside them, his own arrogant signature was scrawled. He had practiced the crimes and then thrown the evidence on the fire, but the paper had been too damp to burn completely. Jonas carefully folded the charred, damning pages and placed them inside his coat. He now held the truth in his hands. The threat had escalated, but the quiet man of the mountain had gathered the evidence, one small, discarded piece at a time. The final confrontation was not loud or violent. It was as quiet and deliberate as everything Jonas did. He knew Hemlock would not wait the full 30 days. He would bring the law to bear as soon as he thought he could, to intimidate and overwhelm. The sheriff arrived 2 weeks later, a tired-looking man with a drooping mustache, with Hemlock riding beside him, looking smug and triumphant. Jonas was waiting on the porch. He was not armed, save for the axe that rested on the chopping block nearby. He simply stood, a silent mountain of a man, his presence an immovable fact. Lian came to stand beside him, her face pale but her expression resolute. She did not stand behind him. She stood with him. "Sheriff," Hemlock said, gesturing to Lian, "this woman is illegally occupying bank property." "I have the foreclosure notice right here," the sheriff sighed, clearly not enjoying his task. "I'm sorry, but if the papers are in order, the papers are a lie," Jonas said, his voice calm and even. He stepped forward, not toward Hemlock, but toward the sheriff. He held out the charred papers he had rescued from the fire. "Mr. Hemlock is a very careless man." The sheriff took the papers, his brow furrowed. He smoothed them out, his eyes scanning the contents. He saw the practiced forgeries, the repeated signatures next to Hemlock's own. He looked from the papers to Hemlock, whose face had gone a sickly white. The smug certainty drained out of him, replaced by the panicked look of a rat caught in a trap. "This ain't proof of anything," Hemlock stammered. "Just scribbles, and Mrs. Gable and old Mr. Peterson filed complaints last month," the sheriff said, his voice suddenly hard. "Said you were trying to push them off their land with papers that didn't look right. Said their signatures were forged." He looked back down at the papers in his hand. "These look an awful lot like the scribbles on their notices." Hemlock was deflating, shrinking before their eyes. His power had been in the illusion of legitimacy, in the weight of official-looking documents. With that illusion stripped away, he was just a common thief. The sheriff folded the papers and tucked them into his own coat pocket. He looked at Hemlock with profound disgust. "I think you and I need to ride back to town and have a long talk about the bank's ledgers." He didn't arrest him, not yet. He just turned his horse and waited, his meaning clear. Defeated, Hemlock mounted his horse and rode away, the sheriff following close behind. He did not look back. The threat was gone. It had been dismantled not with a gun, but with quiet patience and a handful of burnt paper. Lian and Jonas stood on the porch, watching them go. The silence that fell was deep and peaceful. The land was safe. It was hers. Later that day, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Lian walked into the barn. Jonas was there, quietly packing his few belongings into a bedroll. His wound was healed. The threat was gone. The winter was over. It was time for him to leave. His bag was packed, his knife was at his belt. He was ready to return to the mountains, to the solitary life he knew. He stood to leave, the question of his departure hanging heavy and unspoken between them. Liane's heart felt like a lead weight in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, but she was not ready. She did not ask him to stay. The words would not form. Instead, she held out the simple wooden bowl she was carrying. It was filled with rice and steamed vegetables, a small portion saved from her own meal. Her hand trembled slightly. Looking at him, at his packed bag, at the door that led back to the wilderness, she asked the same question she had asked on that first, cold night. "Have you eaten?" Jonas looked down at the bowl in her hands. He looked at her face, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes. He looked around the small, quiet barn that he had repaired, at the homestead he had defended, at the woman who had saved his life. He slowly, deliberately, reached out and took the bowl from her. Then he turned, walked over to a hay bale, and sat down. With his other hand, he untied the knot on his bedroll, letting it fall open at his feet. He had not said a word, but his action spoke louder than any promise. He was not leaving. He was home. Thank you for watching.